My name is Vivian Aldrich, 32 years old. The private investigator my sister hired introduced himself as a friend of the family. I knew he wasn't because I don't forget faces, and because a real friend of the family would never ask me how many bedrooms my grandmother's house had. He knew the answer. He was testing whether I would lie. I didn't lie. I gave him something much more useful, a story that was almost true. 12 days later, my sister stood up in front of our entire family and presented his findings as proof I had committed fraud. The folder was thick. Her voice was steady. Her smile was the kind you wear when you think you've already won. She hadn't. She was holding the wrong evidence about the wrong person. And in about 4 minutes, she was going to find out why. Let me start with my grandmother. Grandma Constance called me on a Tuesday in January 2023. It was early, before 8. And she never called before 8 unless something was wrong. She said, "The doctor found something, Viv. I don't want to make a big thing of it." I drove down that Friday. Claudette sent a sunflower emoji. That was the beginning of 3 years. Not dramatic years, not years full of big speeches or tearful bedside confessions. Just years of showing up. Every Friday, I drove from my apartment in Charlotte to Grandma's house on Birchwood Lane, 40 minutes each way. I learned her medication schedule. I drove her to appointments. I sat in waiting rooms reading the same outdated magazines over and over because she didn't like waiting alone. Grandma kept a paper calendar on her kitchen wall, one of those big desk pad ones with a square for each day. Every Friday, she wrote my name in the square with a blue pen, just Viv. Sometimes she drew a small star next to it. I didn't know she was doing that until the last month, when I happened to glance at the calendar and saw 3 years of blue pen and small stars. I didn't say anything, neither did she. In August of 2025, someone tried to break into her house. They didn't get far. Grandma heard the window and yelled loud enough that the neighbor's porch light came on, and whoever it was ran. But it shook her. She was 84 years old, and she'd lived alone in that house for 11 years, and for the first time she seemed to feel it. I drove down the next day with a Nest camera kit. She said, "I don't want to feel like I'm being watched in my own home." I said, "You're not being watched, Grandma. You're being protected." She thought about it for 3 days. Then she stopped arguing. I mounted one camera in the living room, angled toward the front door and the main hallway, another in the entry near the stairs, both connected to cloud backup, recording continuously, accessible from my phone. She never looked at the cameras after that. She just lived in her house the way she always had, made her coffee, watched her programs, kept the Wedgwood china lined up in the glass cabinet in the dining room, 12 place settings fully intact. She'd bought that set in 1987, used it every Christmas, and had never once let it leave the house despite the fact that Claudette had been asking to borrow it for years. "That china goes with the house, Viv," she said once. "That china stays." In November of 2025, she called Patricia Holt. Patricia had been her estate attorney for 16 years. They had a relationship built on mutual respect and very little small talk. Grandma called her, they set a date, and Patricia came to the house on the 14th with the updated documents. Grandma asked me to be there, not to help. She didn't need help. She said, "I want someone I trust in the building." But when Patricia arrived and the paperwork was laid out on the kitchen table, Grandma looked at me and said, "Viv, wait in the hallway." I said, "What?" She said, "I don't want anyone saying my granddaughter twisted my arm. You wait outside. This is between me and Patricia." So I stood in the hallway for 22 minutes. I could hear the low murmur of voices, the occasional rustle of paper. When the door opened, Grandma was sitting straight in her chair, and her hands were folded on the table. And she looked like she'd just settled something she'd been thinking about for a long time. She handed me a small tin box, blue, with a little latch, the kind she used to keep sewing supplies in when I was a child. She said, "Don't open this until I'm gone." I put it in my bag and didn't ask questions. 3 weeks later, on December 1st, 2025, Grandma Constance died in her sleep. Her doctor said her heart simply stopped. He said she would not have felt anything. He said it the way doctors say those things, carefully, because it's true, and also because they've learned it's what people need to hear. Within 24 hours, Claudette was in Charlotte. My sister is 39 years old. She is 4 inches taller than me, blonder than the last time I saw her, and she arrived at Grandma's house with a large rolling suitcase, and her husband Neil, and the specific energy of someone who has been rehearsing something in the car. She walked through the house like she was doing an appraisal. I watched her open the pantry, look at the coat closet, run her hand along the top of the bookshelf in the hallway. Then she walked into the dining room and stood in front of the Wedgwood cabinet. She pressed her fingertips against the glass. She said, "This needs to be packed carefully." I said, "It's not going anywhere yet, Claudette." She looked at me like I had said something in a foreign language. That night, I heard her and Neil talking in the kitchen after I'd gone to my room. Their voices were low, but the house was quiet. And I caught pieces. The attorney, the timing, does she have copies? And once clearly, Patricia Holt. I lay on the bed that had been my bed since I was 7 years old, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about the fact that my grandmother had been dead for less than 36 hours. Then I thought about something else. In the fall of last year, Neil had sent me a text by mistake. He'd meant to send it to Claudette, but he had an old contact entry with both our numbers, and he picked wrong. The text said, "Lender wants answer by Friday. If the Aldrich estate doesn't come through, we're looking at foreclosure on the Mecklenburg property. Do not tell your dad." I had screenshotted it and said nothing. I filed it away the way you file away something you hope you'll never need. By the end of that first night, I was starting to think I would need it. Claudette and I are the only children of Gerald Aldrich, who is 64 years old, retired, and has spent his entire adult life taking the path of least resistance between his two daughters. When Claudette and I were children, that meant she got the bigger room, the later curfew, and the benefit of the doubt. When we were adults, it meant she got the down payment for her first house, the tuition for her MBA, and the $30,000 she borrowed from Grandma in 2019 and never paid back. I got a handshake at graduation and a card that said, "Proud of you," in my father's handwriting, which was perfectly fine. Except that by then, I'd learned not to expect more than that. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it because it matters to the story. My father is not a cruel man. He is a tired man who learned that agreeing with Claudette was easier than questioning her, and he made that choice so many times that it became the only choice he knew how to make. The dinner on the second night, the four of us plus Dad, who had driven down from Greensboro, was quiet in the particular way that happens when everyone is thinking about things they aren't saying. Claudette talked about logistics. Dad nodded. Neil ate. I watched. At the end of the meal, Claudette set down her fork and said, "I have some concerns about the will. I think we need to look at everything carefully. There are some things that don't add up." She looked at me when she said it. Dad looked at his plate. That 2-second pause, him looking at his plate instead of at me, was 32 years of our relationship summed up in a gesture. I'd felt that weight my entire life. I just hadn't ever had a name for it until that moment. I said, "Okay." That was all I said. "Okay," and I went to bed. The man in the gray jacket appeared at the funeral lunch 2 days later. It was held at the Church Fellowship Hall, Hillcrest Presbyterian, where Grandma had attended for 40 years. There were finger sandwiches and a coffee urn, and about 60 people, most of whom I recognized, all of whom said the same 7 things people say at these events. He introduced himself as a friend of the family. He shook my hand and held it slightly longer than strangers do. He said his name was Stuart Boone. The name meant nothing to me. We talked for a few minutes. He said things about Grandma that were vague enough to apply to anyone. Lovely woman, wonderful spirit. And I nodded and waited. People who actually knew my grandmother told specific stories. They mentioned the lemon cake she brought to potlucks. They mentioned the library, where she'd volunteered every Thursday for 14 years. They mentioned specific conversations. Stuart Boone did not mention anything specific. Then he said, 4 bedrooms, right? Big house for one person." I stopped. Grandma's house had 3 bedrooms and a small room she used for reading that wasn't really a 4th bedroom, but some people counted it. Someone who'd been inside the house might say 4. Someone who'd looked up the property listing, which listed it as 3 and a possible flex space, would say 3. I said, 3.5. The 4th is more of a reading room. He nodded like he was filing it away, because he was. The second question came a few minutes later, dropped into a lull in the conversation like it was casual. He said, "Did your grandmother keep good records?" I imagine there's a lot of paperwork with an estate this size. I said, "She was organized." He said, "Smart, it helps when everything's documented. Did she keep copies of things, legal paperwork, that kind of thing, in one place, or scattered around?" That was when I knew exactly what he was, not a friend of the family, the aunt. not a colleague of anyone's. A licensed private investigator, hired to build a case around the will, specifically around whether the will my grandmother had signed in November was legitimate. I smiled. I said, "She kept things in different places. You know how it is." He said he did. He gave me his card, just a name and a number, no company. I put it in my pocket and went to find my cousin Dale to talk about something else entirely. That night, I called a contact at the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. She's a paralegal I'd worked with twice on contract projects. I gave her Stuart Boone's name and number and asked her to run a basic search. She called back in 40 minutes. She said, "Viv, this guy specializes in contested wills. He's been retained in 4 probate cases in the last 2 years, all of them in North Carolina. 2 of them involved undue influence claims." I said, "That's helpful." She said, "Should I be worried for you?" I said, "No, but thank you." I sat at Grandma's kitchen table for a long time after that. The calendar was still on the wall. The last blue pen entry said Viv in the Friday square of the last week of November, with a small star next to it. The star was a little shakier than the others. Her hands had been weaker by then. I thought about the fact that Claudette had hired a private investigator before the funeral. Lunch was even over. She had known about the new will. She had known she was out of it. And she had moved fast. I could confront her. I could call Patricia Holt and tell her what was happening. I could go to my father and lay it out and watch him try to figure out which way to lean. Or I could wait. I picked up my phone and called Stuart Boone back. He answered on the second ring. I said, "I'm sorry, I just wanted to follow up. I kept thinking about what you asked earlier, about documentation. I think Grandma may have kept some things online. She mentioned once that she wanted a backup. Something called, I think it was just her name and estate docs. A Google Drive folder. I don't have access to it, she set it up herself, but I think it exists." He said, "Do you remember when she set it up?" I said, "A while ago, 2019 maybe. I don't know if she ever actually used it." There was a pause. Then he said, "That's useful, thank you, Vivian." He was trying to keep the interest out of his voice. He wasn't entirely successful. I said goodnight and went to bed. The next 11 days were 2 things at once. On the surface, they were the days after a funeral. I handled paperwork. I spoke with Patricia. I sorted through Grandma's belongings slowly and carefully, the way she would have wanted. I made sure the Wedgwood stayed exactly where it was. Underneath, I was building. A day after the call, I mentioned Stuart in passing to Claudette. I said something like, "That man Stuart from the lunch seemed nice. Did you know him through Dad?" And watched her face do a small controlled thing, a tightening. She said she didn't think she knew him. I said, and changed the subject. She was better at this than I'd expected, but not quite good enough. 3 days after the funeral, I ran into Stuart at the coffee shop 2 blocks from Grandma's house. I don't believe in coincidences when it comes to money, so I assumed he was following my schedule. I sat down across from him like we'd planned it. I said, "I looked for that folder. I found the link." He said, "Oh," I said, "it's empty. She must have set it up and never used it." "Here," I wrote the link on a napkin. The folder was real. I'd created it in 2019 after Grandma asked me to help her set up a Google account, and she'd never opened it again. It contained nothing. Stuart looked at the link for a moment. I could see him constructing the narrative. Empty folder. Vivian was nervous about it. Maybe she accessed it and deleted something. I said, "It's probably nothing. She was never very tech-savvy." He said, "Right." He folded the napkin. 2 days after that, I mentioned someone named George. I brought him up the way you mentioned someone everyone should already know. I said, "I think there was someone named George at the signing. Older man, gray jacket, used to sit in the 3rd pew at Hillcrest. I don't know if he was a formal witness or just happened to be there." Stuart's pen moved. I said, "I might be misremembering. It was a stressful day." He said, "Of course." The next day, Claudette called me for the first time since the dinner. Her voice was careful, walking the line between casual and deliberate. She said, "Hey, do you remember which church Grandma usually went to? I'm trying to coordinate something for the memorial board." I gave her the address of Hillcrest Presbyterian. I did not ask why she needed it. I knew why. She was sending Stuart to find George. George did not exist. Stuart was going to spend days working through the membership rolls of Hillcrest Presbyterian, looking for an older man named George who sat in the 3rd pew, and he was not going to find him. and he was going to interpret that as concealment rather than invention. The third clue was the most important one. I mentioned the laptop. I brought it up in a phone call with Stuart. We were talking about Grandma's paperwork, which he kept circling back to, and I let my voice go quiet for exactly one beat. Just one. Not long enough to be obvious, long enough to register. I said, "There's also her laptop. An old Dell, she's had it for years. I haven't had a chance to go through her files yet." I paused. "There might be things in there." Stuart's pen moved again. I heard it. I said, "I'll get to it eventually. It's just been a hard week." He said, "Of course, take your time." The laptop was a Dell from 2017. The battery had been dead since June. The password was the name of a cat Grandma had loved in 2002, Biscuit, and the files it contained were 11 years of recipe clippings saved as Word documents and 240 photos from a church trip to Williamsburg. Stuart was going to focus on that laptop. He was going to tell Claudette about that laptop. Claudette was going to think about that laptop. Neither of them was going to look at the cameras on the wall. That same night, I called Ruth Kenmore. Ruth had been Grandma's closest friend for 40 years. They had met at a neighborhood association meeting in 1985 and had been inseparable since. In the quiet way that women of that generation are inseparable, weekly phone calls, standing Thursday lunches at the diner on Tryon Street, the kind of friendship that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Ruth had been the first witness when Grandma signed the November will. The second witness was Patricia's paralegal. Both signatures were on file. I said, "Ruth, I need you to come to a family meeting next Sunday. I need you to sit quietly until I say your name." There was a pause on her end. Then she said, "Constance told me this would happen." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Ruth, when I'm gone, Claudette is going to make trouble for Viv, and Viv is going to handle it, but she might need a witness." Ruth paused again. "She said you were like your grandfather, never angry before you had the evidence." I didn't say anything for a moment. Ruth said, "She also said the tin box has something for you. Have you opened it?" I said, "Not yet." She said, "You'll know when." I said goodnight, and I sat in the dark for a while. On Thursday, I called Patricia Holt and told her everything. Stuart Boone, the fake clues, what I suspected Claudette was planning. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "The November will was filed with the probate court on the 28th. Case number NC-2025-PRB-4412. It is on record. There is nothing Claudette can do to make it disappear." I said, "I know, but she doesn't know that." Patricia said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need you at that meeting on Sunday." She said, "I'll be there." On Friday, December 3rd, 8 days after the funeral, 3 days before the meeting, I was at my desk in my apartment working through a client spreadsheet when my phone buzzed. Nest notification, living room, motion detected. I almost ignored it. The neighbor's tabby cat had figured out how to slip through the side gate and had been triggering the sensor twice a week. I opened the app. It was not the cat. Claudette was walking into my grandmother's living room. She was wearing jeans and a dark jacket, and she was carrying her brown leather bag. The large one, the one she used when she was traveling. She didn't look around. She didn't hesitate. She walked directly to the tall oak cabinet against the far wall, the one where Grandma kept her important papers, had kept them for 40 years in the bottom left drawer, and she crouched down and opened it. I watched on my phone screen. She pulled out a manila envelope, the kind with a metal clasp, thick, the size of a legal document. She opened the top and looked inside. Just a brief look, like she was confirming something, not reading. And then she put it in her leather bag. She stood up. She walked back out the front door. The whole thing took 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I sat very still for a moment. Then I took a screenshot of the notification. Then I opened the Nest app's saved footage and verified that the full recording had backed up to the cloud, which it had, with a timestamp in the lower right corner. December 3rd, 2025. 14/22/07. Then I texted Patricia Holt. "The 2019 document has been removed from the house. We should talk." She responded in 90 seconds. "Calling you now." Patricia said, "She took the 2019 will." I said, "Yes." She said, "Vivian, that document has no legal standing. The 2025 will supersedes it entirely. It was voided the moment Constance signed the new one. She took worthless paper." I said, I know. There was a silence on the line. Then Patricia said, Oh, I said, save the footage timestamp. I'll need it at the family meeting. That evening, Claudette texted me, planning a family meeting for Sunday at Uncle Thomas's. Everyone needs to be there. We need to talk about the estate. I looked at the text for a moment. Then I wrote back, I'll be there. 2 words. I sent it and put my phone down. The meeting was at 2 o'clock on Sunday at my Uncle Thomas's house. A split level on the east side of Charlotte that still had the same furniture it had when I was 12. Thomas is my father's older brother, and he had always existed in a comfortable neutrality between Claudette and me, the way relatives do when they don't want to get involved, but also don't want to be the last to know things. He had agreed to host. He didn't know what he was hosting. I wore the navy blazer. Grandma had bought it for me 3 Christmases ago. She said it made me look like I knew what I was doing. That morning, I did know what I was doing. I got there 5 minutes early. Claudette's car was already in the driveway. So was a gray Civic I didn't recognize. Stuart's, I assumed. And my father's Subaru, parked slightly crooked the way he always parked, like he'd been distracted. Ruth Kenmore arrived 2 minutes after I did. She was wearing a dark green cardigan, and she looked exactly like what she was. A 66-year-old woman who had been somebody's best friend for 40 years and was here to do one last thing for her. I showed her to a seat at the side of the table near the window. I told her to wait. Patricia Holt had arrived before either of us. She was sitting in the corner with a leather portfolio on her lap, and she nodded at me when I came in. Claudette saw me and smiled. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting. The room held. Claudette and Neil at the head of the table, my father to Claudette's left, Uncle Thomas and Aunt Beverly on the near side, my cousins Dale and Greg across from them, Ruth at the window, Patricia in the corner, and Stuart Boone. Introduced by Claudette as an independent consultant she'd retained to look into some estate concerns, sitting at the opposite end from me. Claudette had arranged the chairs. I was sitting alone on one side. I pulled out my chair and sat down and said nothing. Stuart opened his laptop. He laid it out efficiently, I'll give him that. He'd built a coherent-looking case from almost nothing, which, if I'm being honest, required some skill. He had a timeline. He had the Google Drive folder, with a screenshot showing it was empty and noting that it had been created in 2019, which he called suspiciously coincidental with the timing of the original will. He had a page about George, a witness Vivian had referenced who could not be located in any records at Hillcrest Presbyterian or in the names of any known associates of the deceased. He had a note about a laptop that had not yet been turned over for examination. He had a general statement about undue influence, the frequency of Vivian's visits, the isolation from other family, the timing of the will change relative to the decline in Constance's health. He was careful. He didn't say fraud. He said pattern of concern. He said questions that warrant examination. My father had picked up one of the printout copies Claudette had made for everyone. He was reading along, following Stuart's presentation line by line. He didn't look up. Uncle Thomas was nodding slowly, not agreement exactly, more like the nod you do when you're processing something and trying to stay neutral. Dale caught my eye once and looked away quickly. Aunt Beverly looked at me with an expression I recognized. The I'm so sorry, but I don't know what's true expression. I'd been getting that expression from people my entire life. It used to bother me. That Sunday, I found it clarifying. When Stuart finished, Claudette stood up. She had prepared this. The pacing, the pauses, the choice of words, all of it was deliberate. She said she wasn't there to accuse anyone. She said she was there because she loved her grandmother and wanted to honor her true wishes. She said the phrase improperly influenced twice. She said the 2025 will had been executed under circumstances that warranted scrutiny, and that the 2019 will, the one that reflected Constance's long-held intentions, was the document that should govern the estate. She reached into her leather bag. She put the manila envelope on the table. She said, "This is the original 2019 will. I believe this represents what Grandma actually wanted before things became complicated." The envelope sat on the table, thick, labeled in Grandma's handwriting. Estate, original 2019. Claudette looked at me. Her smile was composed and certain. It was the smile of someone who believed they had already won, who was just waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. She said, "Vivian, Is there anything you'd like to say? The room went quiet. I looked at her for a moment, then I said, "My turn." I opened my laptop. I did not rush. I said, "Before I play anything, I want to introduce two people who are already in this room." I looked toward the window. I said, "Ruth Kenmore. She has been Grandma's closest friend for 40 years. She is also one of the two witnesses who signed Grandma's will on November 14th, 2025. Claudette's head turned toward Ruth. Ruth sat with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing. She didn't need to say anything yet. I looked toward the corner. I said, "Patricia Holt. She has been Grandma's estate attorney for 16 years. She filed the November 2025 will with the Mecklenburg County Probate Court on November 28th. The case number is NC-2025-PRB-4412. Patricia opened her portfolio and set a document on the table. She slid it toward the center. I said, "The envelope Claudette just put on the table contains the 2019 will. That document was legally voided 6 weeks ago, the moment Grandma signed the new one. It has no legal standing." I paused. "What I'd like to know is how it left this house." Claudette opened her mouth. Neil put his hand on her arm. She closed her mouth. I turned my laptop screen so the room could see it. I pressed play. The footage was 4 minutes and 17 seconds long. I had watched it enough times that I could have described it from memory, frame by frame, but watching it with the room, watching the faces around the table as they watched it, was a different thing. The timestamp in the lower right corner said December 3rd, 2025, 14:22:07. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet, when everyone understands that they are witnessing something that cannot be taken back. Claudette walking in, the leather bag, the oak cabinet, the crouching, the opening of the bottom drawer, the manila envelope lifted out, held briefly, examined, not long enough to read, just long enough to confirm the label, and then put into the bag. 4 minutes, 17 seconds, the front door closing. The camera didn't miss a frame. You could hear the air conditioning. You could hear Dale shift in his chair somewhere around the 2-minute mark. You could hear Neil breathing, just slightly faster than normal. As Claudette's face appeared on the screen for the third time in the recording, close to the camera, clear and unambiguous. When the footage ended, the screen went dark. Nobody spoke for what felt like a very long time. Then Ruth Kenmore stood up. She didn't need prompting. She stood up the way someone stands up when they've been sitting quietly for 20 years, waiting for the one moment that required them. She said, "I want to be clear about what happened on November 14th. Her voice was steady. "Constance called me the week before and asked me to come. She told me she was updating her will and she wanted someone she trusted to witness it. When Patricia arrived, Constance asked Vivian to wait in the hallway." Ruth looked around the table. "Those were her exact words. She said, 'I don't want anyone saying my granddaughter twisted my arm. You wait outside.' She was specific about it, deliberate. She understood that her decision might be questioned after she was gone, and she arranged things accordingly." Ruth sat back down. She folded her hands. She said, "Constance Aldrich was the most clear-headed person in that room on November 14th. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she knew exactly what would happen afterward." The envelope was still on the table, the thick manila envelope with Grandma's handwriting on the tab. Nobody was looking at it the same way now. My father had set down the printout. He set it down slowly, carefully, like he was placing something fragile on a surface, like he was deciding something with the motion itself. He looked at the envelope, then he looked at the laptop screen, which was dark now. Then he looked at Claudette. She was very still. Neil had moved his hand from her arm. He was looking at the table. Patricia Holt said, "Ms. Aldrich Monroe." Her voice was measured and without any particular emotion, which was more effective than anger would have been. "The removal of property from an estate before probate is complete is a criminal offense in the state of North Carolina. What you've just seen on that recording constitutes evidence of that act. I strongly advise you not to say anything further without your own legal counsel present." The room absorbed that. Then my father stood up. He was 64 years old, and he was not a man who made dramatic gestures. He had spent most of my life making the quiet gesture of not choosing, the gesture of looking at his plate. He stood up and he walked around the table. He walked past Claudette without stopping. He walked to where I was sitting. He said, "Vivian," just my name, like it had weight. He said, I owe you more than an apology for today. I've owed you one for a very long time before today. He didn't look back at Claudette when he said it. For the first time that I could remember, my father looked at me and he didn't look away. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Claudette and Neil left Uncle Thomas's house without another word. The manila envelope stayed on the table. Patricia picked it up and put it in her portfolio. My cousins sat for a while longer. Nobody quite knew what to do with themselves. Dale got up and made coffee, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. Aunt Beverly put her hand over mine for a moment and then didn't say anything, which was also the right call. My father stayed. We didn't talk much that afternoon. Not about the important things. That would come later, but he stayed, and that was new. The following Tuesday, Patricia submitted a formal referral to the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office. She attached the nest footage, the timestamp documentation, and a timeline of the estate proceedings. The referral described the offense as removal of estate property prior to probate completion, a Class H felony under North Carolina law, carrying potential imprisonment of up to 25 months. By Wednesday, 2 of Neil's commercial contracting clients had quietly dropped their agreements with his firm. In that business, reputation moves faster than any official communication. The Mecklenburg construction community was not large. It did not take long. The investigation was ongoing. Whether Claudette would be charged, whether it would go to trial, whether Neil would be named in any additional capacity. All of that was still being worked through when I sat down to tell this story. What was clear was that the estate was not in dispute. The November 2025 will was confirmed. Case number NC-2025-PRB-4412 was proceeding without challenge. I had a phone call with my father that lasted 47 minutes. It was the longest conversation we had ever had. We talked about Grandma. We talked about some other things. Not all of them got resolved, but they got started, which felt like more than I had expected. I executed Grandma's estate according to her instructions. The house appraised at $750,000. 30% of the sale proceeds, $225,000, was directed into a fund established in her name, the Eleanor Constance Aldrich First Generation Scholarship, created on December 15, 2025, to support students in Mecklenburg County who would be the first in their families to attend a 4-year college. Grandma never went to college. She raised 2 kids, kept a house, volunteered at the library every Thursday for 14 years, and built something real out of almost nothing. The scholarship wasn't my idea. It was hers. She'd put it in the will because she'd thought about it for a long time, and it was the kind of person she was. And I just made sure it happened. Patricia handed me the keys to the house on a Wednesday afternoon. The legal transfer complete, my name on the title. I drove there and sat in the driveway for a few minutes. The house looked the same. It always looked the same from the outside. That was the thing about houses where someone has lived for a long time. They hold the shape of that person long after the person is gone. I went inside. I stood in the hallway for a moment. The calendar was still on the kitchen wall. I hadn't taken it down. The last entry was still there in the Friday square of the last week of November, Viv, in blue pen, with a small shaky star next to it. I walked into the dining room. The Wedgwood was exactly where it always was, every piece. 12 place settings, fully intact, behind the glass of the cabinet. I opened the cabinet and I ran my hand along the edge of a dinner plate the way Grandma used to do every Christmas morning, slowly, like she was making sure it was still all there, like she was counting something she loved. I don't know if I'll use it. I don't know if I'll sell the house. I don't know if I'll stay in Charlotte or move somewhere else, start something new. I was still figuring all of that out, but I knew it stayed. For now, it stayed. I remembered the tin box. It was still in my bag, where it had been since the day Grandma handed it to me in November. Blue with a little latch, the kind she used to keep sewing supplies in when I was a child. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not on a chair, on the floor. I don't know why. It just seemed right. It seemed like the kind of thing you do when you're about to read something that was written for you by someone who knew you wouldn't be okay reading it at a normal height. Inside the box was a small envelope. My name was on it in Grandma's handwriting, the particular version of her handwriting she used for things that were just between us, with a small curl at the end of the V. The way she'd been writing it since I was 7 years old. I sat on the kitchen floor and I opened the envelope. 2 pages, both sides. Her handwriting was shakier than I was used to. Her hands had been weakening in those last weeks, but every word was legible. She'd taken her time. She wrote, "Viv, if you're reading this, then things went the way I thought they would. I want you to know that I'm not surprised, and I don't want you to be angry on my behalf. I know Claudette. I have known her for 39 years. She was not born difficult. She was made that way, a little bit at a time, by being told too many times that wanting things was the same as deserving them. I am not angry at her. I am sad for her. But the house is yours and the decision is mine, and I made it with a clear head on a November afternoon with Ruth sitting across the table from me. You stayed without asking for anything in return. I watched you for 3 years drive down here every Friday and sit in waiting rooms and learn the names of medications and eat bad hospital cafeteria food and pretend it didn't bother you. You didn't stay because you expected something. You stayed because you love me. That is the difference, Vivienne. That has always been the difference. Don't let anyone make you justify it. Not cousins, not uncles, not your father. I say that especially about your father. He is a good man who has been a coward about the wrong things for a long time. He loves you. He has just not been very brave about showing it. I think he can learn. I think he is going to try. I hope you let him. I hope you don't carry this longer than you need to. I hope the house gives you something good, whatever you decide to do with it. I hope the scholarship helps someone the way I always wished someone had helped me. I'm very proud of you. I have always been very proud of you. I just wanted to say it in writing where nobody can argue with it. All my love, Grandma C. I sat on the kitchen floor for a while after I finished reading. Then I saw the P.S. It was written at the bottom of the second page in slightly larger letters, like she'd added it, and then decided to make sure I didn't miss it. P.S. The tin box also has a spare key to the Wedgwood cabinet. I never told Claudette where I kept it. I laughed. Alone on the kitchen floor of my grandmother's house, holding a 2-page letter written by someone who had been 3 steps ahead of everyone in this story from the very beginning, I laughed. Because that was Grandma C. Careful about everything. Quiet about everything. Thorough in ways that didn't announce themselves. She had thought of the cabinet key. She had thought of Ruth. She had thought of Patricia. She had thought of asking me to stand in the hallway so that no one could ever say what they wanted to say. She had prepared every single piece of this. I set the letter down on the kitchen floor beside me. I looked at the calendar on the wall, the last blue Viv with the shaky star. I thought about what it means to be believed by someone before you need to prove anything, to have someone see you clearly enough and love you specifically enough, to build a quiet, careful structure around you so that when the moment came, you would not be standing there alone. I don't know what comes next. I don't know whether my father and I will ever fully close the distance, though for the first time, I think we're both trying. I don't know whether Claudette will understand someday what she threw away. Not just the house, not just the money. What she threw away is harder to name than that. And I think the not naming it is part of why she threw it away. What I know is this. For the first time in a very long time, I don't need anyone in that room to believe me. The camera did that. And Grandma did the rest.